My name is Gary Prizzo, and I'm here to talk about two petitions to desegregate U.S. history in California and Los Angeles Unified School District public schools. But before that, I'd like to talk about the way McGraw-Hill complied with a requirement by the California State Board of Education that the life and contributions of Martin Luther King be discussed in every grade. McGraw-Hill did this in their fifth grade textbook, Making a New Nation, by including this picture of Martin. And below that picture is a caption that talks about the Emancipation Proclamation, how African Americans after the Civil War were segregated and treated with prejudice and injustice. And the caption ends with a mention of Martin's I Have a Dream speech. For the sharp-eyed, you will have noticed that this blurb on Martin is in a section called People You Should Know. And according to this section, you should also know James Madison, Daniel Shays, and George Mason. And it makes sense that you should know these three individuals in that chapter because that chapter is about the historic process that led to the Constitutional Convention in the late 1780s. Now, of course, James Madison and George Mason had a critical role in writing the Constitution and pushing through the 3/5 rule that dehumanized Africans and reduced them to 3/5 of a human being. And from their perspective, it makes sense because both of them were major Virginia plantation owners, and between them, they enslaved hundreds of people. If you're going to bring Martin back in time, to the moment where the Constitution is being written, then almost certainly Martin would have pointed out to James Madison and George Mason that because of this Constitution and the 3/5 rule and the fact that they kept slavery going and in fact made it worse, that because of all of these things, that he had to lose his life fighting for the rights of African Americans centuries later. In addition, he would almost certainly point it out to them that this Constitution would directly lead to the Dred Scott decision, where even free Black men, women, and children could never be considered citizens of the United States, and that would lead to a bloody civil war where hundreds of thousands of people would be killed and the South would lay in ruins. But instead, McGraw-Hill doesn't mention any of the connection between the Civil War and this Constitution that was written by James Madison and George Mason and others. And we can say that at best, this is really a cut and paste job to strictly comply with the California State Board of Education requirement. At worst, it does seem mocking of the civil rights movement and what led to the necessity of this civil rights movement, which is this Constitution that dehumanized African Americans. Now let's talk about the petitions. These petitions are ultimately motivated by an outdated 28-year-old document that is not well known by the general public but plays a central role in California education. It is called the History Social Science Content Standards for California Public Schools. It's available for free online. Going forward, we will refer to that document simply as the standards. That document defines the standards for good history education in California public schools. We are going to discuss PK through 12, even though the 1998 standards are technically for K through 12. This outdated document is heavily focused on Europe, Europeans, and their exploration of the world. For example, despite covering the critical period of 1600 to 1850, when nearly all the ancestors of African Americans arrived, the fifth grade standards entirely omit African perspectives and contributions. However, if one conflates being enslaved with being African, then there is a single subsection, 5.4.6, in this important document that considers the perspective of what the 1998 standards call slave families in response to their condition. We see it here underlined in green, There's one additional mention of slavery which asks students to understand how the ideals of the Declaration of Independence changed the way people viewed slavery. It's rectangled in green here. This is a question about a possible change in the perspective of Euro-Americans after the Revolutionary War, because Africans already knew how they felt about slavery both before and after the Declaration of Independence. They wanted to be free. Now, let's discuss the first petition. It is titled Desegregate the 1998 History Social Science Content Standards for California Public Schools. It was written on behalf of LAUSD parents for a desegregated history because it was initiated by Los Angeles Unified School District parents. It is, however, a California-wide petition. Parents outside California are also encouraged to modify it for their own needs. This petition is addressed to the California State Board of Education and to the Honorable Gavin Newsom, Governor of California. The petition reads as follows. We, the undersigned, demand that the 1998 PK-12 History Social Science Content Standards for California Public Schools, hereinafter referred to as the Standards, be thoroughly modernized to fully desegregate U.S. history. A cursory look at the fifth grade standards, covering the year 1600 to 1850, outlined over 8 sections and 43 subsections, make its deficits glaring. Africans go entirely unmentioned, while slave families are noted in one subsection, 5.4.6. 4 subsections refer to indigenous nations, while 38 refer to European expansion or Euro-Americans. The overall portrait is one of thriving Europeans that possess culture, agency, and creativity, a portrayal of defeated indigenous nations, and a non-portrayal of Africans conflated with coping slave families. This portrayal clashes directly with the fact that approximately 1 in 5 persons in the colonies in 1750 was of African ancestry. This petition includes tables describing the minimal African historical content that should be included in the desegregated standards if U.S. history is to be integrated and presented accurately. Again, it is important to emphasize that without African American history, U.S. history is in fact deeply distorted. The first 3 tables are for 5th grade standards. The 4th table concerns the history of ancient civilizations, specifically Egypt. The 5th table concerns world history, specifically Africa. All of these tables follow the same structure. Rectangled in green, they are divided into 4 columns. The first column refers to the minimal number of missing standards that should be added in order to present an accurate and integrated history. The second column refers to the educational gaps created when these standards are omitted. The third column contains supplementary framework content outline. The framework refers to another document called the History Social Science Framework, which expands upon these standards. The fourth column identifies the subsections where these missing standards should appear. We are not going to go through every item in those tables. Instead, we are going to emphasize several key missing standards. One major omission, which significantly distorts U.S. history, is that nowhere does the 1998 standards document discuss how much wealth was produced through the unpaid labor of forcibly enslaved Africans. In this table, this omission is represented by the 4 missing standards rectangled in green. This includes the wealth generated by the massive slave trade of the 17th and 18th century, during which 7.5 million enslaved people were brought to the Americas from Africa, 40% of them on British ships. Most of these ships were built in New England. There was also enormous wealth generated through enslaved labor building the infrastructure of the colonies, cities, ports, and buildings, as well as wealth generated by slavery and the slave trade in both New England and the Middle Colonies. I invite you to read further about this history. The second set of missing standards I want to emphasize also appear in the 5th grade section, specifically in the second table. These missing standards highlight a fundamental motivation for the Patriots to rebel against the British Crown, namely the fear amongst British colonists on the mainland that the British would free enslaved people, especially after slavery became illegal in the United Kingdom through the Somerset versus Stewart case. There was also fear regarding the threat this posed to the racial social order in the colonies, because the British relied on black soldiers in their navy and army. These black soldiers fought alongside English soldiers loyal to the British crown and often shared equally in the spoils of war. Another important omission is the significance of the 27th grievance in the Declaration of Independence. English colonists were deeply concerned about the British regularly threatening to free enslaved people and encouraging rebellion against enslavers as a mean of controlling the colonies. Listing this grievance concerning domestic insurrections last was in fact a sign of how important this issue was to the colonists. Another missing set of standards concerns the proper discussion of the role of black people during the Revolutionary War, as well as the widespread expectation amongst many black patriots that slavery would end following the revolution. However, most Africans did not believe slavery would end if the patriots gained independence, and they were correct. A massive number of enslaved people fled to the British side. Estimates range from 20,000 to 100,000 people. It was the largest freedom movement for enslaved people in US history until the Civil War. Finally, while remaining within fifth grade, there are two additional standards that should be particularly emphasized. U.S. history often discusses westward migration, but it is rarely mentioned that black people were either outright prevented from migrating westward or strongly discouraged from doing so, including after the Civil War. This is critically important because the theft of indigenous land generated substantial wealth for Euro Americans. This is one historical reason for the current wealth disparity between African Americans and European Americans. Another important topic, especially since this chapter extends through 1850, is the abolition movement. The 1998 standards fail to include the extent of the work done by African Americans and others to abolish slavery in the period leading up to the Civil War. The next table concerns ancient civilizations in sixth grade, where Egypt and Mesopotamia are grouped together in a single section. However, the 1998 standards dedicate entire sections to Greece, the Roman Empire, India, China, and the Hebrews. It is also inaccurate to conflate Mesopotamia with Egypt because Mesopotamia is a geographical region, not a single continuous civilization. Multiple civilizations existed there, belonging to different language families, whereas Egypt had a continuous civilization for thousands of years. Egypt built what was arguably the greatest monument and greatest engineering achievement in history prior to the modern era, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Egypt also produced at least 100 foundational inventions and discoveries, and its history extends back to at least 4000 BCE due to the broader cultural area of the Nile Valley and its surroundings. The final table is for seventh grade. The 1998 standards contain a brief discussion of Mali and Ghana in Africa. This is wholly inadequate, partly because much African American ancestry comes from the Congo. In addition, medieval Africa was extraordinarily complex and dynamic. The 1998 standards are therefore wholly inadequate and prevent students from properly understanding the history of Africa and the central role Africa continues to play in global trade today. Next, we are going to discuss the second petition. That petition is titled McGraw-Hill Social Studies, Unsafe at Any Grade. Again, it was initiated by LAUSD parents for a desegregated history. The petition reads as follows. We, the undersigned, demand that the Los Angeles Unified School District Board of Education terminate any and all contracts with McGraw-Hill LLC. The McGraw-Hill social studies content deeply distorts U.S. history with disqualifying and falsifying historical omissions, factual errors, the routine use of the word worker in reference to the forcibly enslaved, and the justification of slavery and land theft. Three of the many falsifying historical omissions in the McGraw-Hill textbook, Making a New Nation, include 1. The 20,000 to 100,000 Africans who escaped slavery and supported the British are omitted from the narrative of the Revolutionary War, while the 5,000 or so Black patriots are highlighted, creating a false narrative of docile Africans supporting their enslavers. 2. The economic output of the enslaved Africans is entirely omitted from the textbook, creating the false narrative that the wealth of the colonies was entirely due to the work ethic, agency, and ingenuity of the European colonists. This falsification is compounded by the omission that the New England and Middle colonies benefited immensely from their enslaved people, slavery in the Caribbean, and the slave trade. 3. The true story of Pocahontas that appears at the beginning of chapter 5 omits that A. She was married to a Powhatan man named Kokum, B. He was killed when she was kidnapped and held hostage for a year by the Jamestown colonists, and C. She was violently treated by the settlers during her captivity. These omissions are designed to create the false narrative that she was able to provide consent to her marriage to John Rolfe and that the colonists behaved ethically. For more example, watch the accompanying videos with this petition. These gross errors directly contradict the mandatory criteria of the California History Social Science Framework. Quote, any gross inaccuracies or deliberate falsifications revealed during the review process will result in disqualification, and any found during the adoption cycle will be subject to removal of the program from the list of state-adopted textbooks. Gross inaccuracies and deliberate falsifications are defined as those requiring changes in content. That's on page 623 of the California History Social Science Framework. These petitions were started in the middle of the 2026 election season. In LAUSD, 3 of the 6 Board of Education members are up for re-election: District 2, District 4, and District 6. Also, candidates are currently running to become governor of California. With your support, we're going to make sure that they take a position on our petitions. That means that you have to convince your brothers, sisters, parents, children, uncles, aunts to read and sign these petitions and advocate for them. We're going to win, if not this election season, the next one, with our objective to desegregate US history and make any textbook that completely erases African American history unacceptable in any public schools. I'll see you next time.